The quiet farmlands of rural Vermont hold many stories, but none quite as extraordinary as what happened at the historic Miller homestead that fateful October morning. What began as intimidation by a ruthless biker gang transformed into an unprecedented display of veteran solidarity when 98-year-old Margaret Peggy Miller made one desperate phone call to her grandson, triggering a chain of events that would unite former Special Forces operators, change lives, and ultimately save a piece of American history that had stood for 5 generations. But this wasn't just another story of good versus evil. It was the thread that would unravel a vast criminal enterprise preying on elderly farmers across 3 states, expose a web of corruption reaching into the local government, and remind an entire community about the unbreakable bonds forged in military service. Margaret Miller stood at her kitchen window, her weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of steaming coffee as she watched the October frost glisten on her fields in the early morning light. At 98, she had witnessed nearly a century of changes from this very spot, but her sharp mind and fierce independence remained unchanged. The farmhouse, built by her great-grandfather in 1875, had weathered countless storms, both literal and metaphorical, its sturdy white clapboard walls and green shutters standing as a testament to the durability of things built with care and purpose. The 175-acre Miller farm was one of the last original family-owned properties in the valley, its maple syrup operation and organic vegetable fields providing a modest but sustainable income that had supported 5 generations of Millers. Peggy, as everyone in town called her, had run the farm alone since her husband Thomas passed away 15 years ago, refusing all offers to sell despite the increasing pressure from developers eyeing the valuable land. The sound of motorcycles in the distance drew her attention. Not the usual weekend riders who often toured the scenic valley roads during peak foliage season, but something different, deeper, more menacing. The noise grew louder, and soon a group of black-clad figures on heavy bikes appeared at the end of her long gravel driveway. Peggy's grip tightened on her coffee mug as she counted them. 7 riders, their bikes expensive and well-maintained, their leather cuts bearing patches she didn't recognize. They pulled up in a practiced formation, killing their engines in unison. The leader, a tall man with a graying beard and heavily tattooed arms, dismounted first. "Base, this is Miller residence." Peggy spoke quietly into the emergency alert pendant. Her grandson James had insisted she wear. Multiple unknown individuals approaching the house. The pendant, disguised as a simple piece of jewelry, was far more sophisticated than standard medical alert devices, a special arrangement James had made through his military connections. "Copy that, Mrs. Miller," came the immediate response in her discreet earpiece. "Maintaining monitoring status. Do you feel immediately threatened?" "Not yet," Peggy replied softly, watching as the men approached her front porch. "But something's not right about this." At 98, Peggy Miller had developed an almost preternatural ability to read people and situations. The instincts that had helped her survive nearly a century told her these weren't simple tourists or lost riders. The group's leader knocked on her door with 3 sharp raps. Peggy took a deep breath, straightened her cardigan, and opened the door with the confidence of someone who had faced down everything from the Great Depression to multiple wars. "Good morning," she said pleasantly but firmly. "What brings you, gentlemen, to Miller Farm?" The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Michael Stone. My associates and I represent a development group interested in properties in this area. We'd like to discuss an opportunity that could benefit you significantly. Peggy noted how the other men had spread out, seemingly casually, to block any clear view of her property from the road. Their body language spoke of military or law enforcement training, but twisted toward darker purposes. "I'm not interested in selling," Peggy replied firmly. "As I've told every other developer who's come calling, this farm has been in my family for 5 generations, and it's not for sale at any price." Stone's smile tightened. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you might want to hear our offer before making that decision. The valley is changing. It's becoming difficult for independent farmers to operate profitably. We'd hate to see you struggle when we could offer you a very comfortable retirement." The threat was subtle but clear. Peggy had heard about other farms in the region experiencing mysterious equipment failures, unexplained accidents, and sudden problems with suppliers. She hadn't connected the dots until this moment. "I appreciate your concern," Peggy said, her voice steady despite the implied threat. "But my answer remains the same. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to." She began to close the door, but Stone's hand shot out, catching it. "Mrs. Miller," his voice dropped lower, "I don't think you understand. We're not like the other developers you've dealt with. We don't take no for an answer. Things can get very complicated for elderly folks living alone out here." Peggy's eyes narrowed. In that moment, she wasn't a 98-year-old widow, but the daughter of a man who had fought at Normandy, the wife of a Korean War veteran, and the grandmother of an elite special forces operator. "Remove your hand from my door, Mr. Stone. You're trespassing." "Base," she sub-vocalized into her pendant. "Situation escalating. Subject attempting forced entry." "Copy that, Mrs. Miller. Security response team notified. Maintain verbal engagement. Only do not attempt physical resistance." Stone's expression darkened. "Look around, Mrs. Miller. No neighbors for miles. No one to hear if you have an accident. No one to help if your beautiful old house has an electrical problem and catches fire. We're trying to be generous, but our patience isn't unlimited." Peggy straightened to her full height, though she still had to look up at Stone. "Young man, I've lived through the Depression, 2 world wars, and the loss of every person I grew up with. If you think you can intimidate me with schoolyard bully tactics, you clearly don't know anything about my generation." One of the other bikers approached, speaking quietly to Stone. "Boss, we've got movement on the satellite road. Might be local traffic." Stone stepped back, his menacing smile returning. "We'll give you some time to reconsider, Mrs. Miller. 1 week. Think carefully about your options. Living alone can be so dangerous at your age." As the bikers mounted their machines, Peggy remained in her doorway, straight-backed and defiant. Only when the last rider disappeared down her driveway did she allow her hands to shake slightly. Base, subjects departing property, 7 individuals on motorcycles heading east on Valley Road. Leader identified himself as Michael Stone. Copy. That, Mrs. Miller. Security team has been notified and is en route. Would you like me to contact James? Peggy watched the dust settle on her driveway. Yes, it's time to call in the cavalry. Inside her kitchen, Peggy settled into her favorite chair, her mind racing despite her outwardly calm demeanor. She knew the stories. 3 farms in the adjacent county had sold well below market value in the past year after experiencing a series of mysterious accidents. The Robertson place had lost its entire dairy herd to an unexplained illness. The Hendersons' barn had burned down 2 days after they refused an offer, the fire marshal finding inconclusive evidence of arson. Her grandson James had warned her about organized criminal enterprises targeting elderly property owners, but she had dismissed his concerns as overprotective. Now, watching a black SUV with government plates approach her house, she realized he had been right to worry. 2 men emerged from the vehicle, their bearing unmistakably military despite their civilian clothes. The older of the 2, a weathered-looking man in his 50s, approached her porch. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Agent David Cooper, private security contractor. Your grandson James arranged our services. May we come in?" Peggy nodded, recognizing the code phrases James had made her memorize. "Of course, I just made a fresh pot of coffee." Inside, Agent Cooper and his partner efficiently swept the house while Peggy prepared coffee. When they were satisfied, they joined her at the kitchen table. "Ma'am, we need to document everything that just occurred," Cooper said, placing a small recording device on the table. "Your pendant captured audio, but we need your personal observations." For the next hour, Peggy provided a detailed account of the encounter, surprising the agents with her recall of specific details: tattoos, bike modifications, accent patterns. When she finished, Cooper looked impressed. "Mrs. Miller, you have an exceptional memory for detail." Peggy smiled slightly. "When you've lived as long as I have, you learn to pay attention. Those men weren't simple thugs. They had military training. The way they moved, positioned themselves, maintained awareness. This is bigger than simple real estate intimidation." Cooper nodded grimly. "We've suspected as much. There's a pattern emerging across the Northeast. Organized groups targeting family farms, particularly those owned by elderly individuals. The tactics are sophisticated, the operations well-funded. And now they're here," Peggy said quietly, looking out at the land her family had worked for. "Generations. Yes, but they made a serious mistake targeting you," Cooper replied. "Your grandson James has significant resources and connections through his military service. He's already mobilizing a response." Peggy's phone rang, James's ringtone. She answered, putting it on speaker. "Grandma, are you okay?" James's voice was tense with concern. "I'm fine, dear. Just had some unwelcome visitors." "I know. I'm already in motion. Cooper's team will maintain immediate security, but I'm bringing in additional resources. These people have no idea who they're dealing with." Peggy smiled, remembering the little boy who had spent summers helping her collect maple sap, now a decorated Special Forces veteran. "James, I won't have violence on this farm." "No violence, Grandma. But these people need to learn there are consequences to threatening the wrong family. I'm calling in some favors. How do you feel about hosting a few dozen retired Special Forces operators for a while?" "Well," Peggy said thoughtfully, "I do have all those empty guest rooms in the old wing, and I've always enjoyed cooking for a crowd. Over the next 48 hours, Miller Farm underwent a subtle but dramatic transformation. To casual observers, nothing seemed unusual about the white farmhouse nestled among the autumn maples. But beneath the peaceful surface, a sophisticated security operation was taking shape. Retired Special Forces operators arrived in small groups, their civilian appearances masking years of elite military training. They came in response to James Miller's call, each one owing their life to his actions in combat or sharing bonds forged in the crucible of warfare. Sarah Chen, a former Army intelligence analyst who had served with James in Afghanistan, established a command center in the farm's old sugar house. The rustic building, traditionally used for boiling maple sap into syrup, now housed state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. Multiple monitors displayed feeds from carefully concealed cameras covering every approach to the property. The thermal imaging system is online, Sarah reported, adjusting several displays. We've got coverage of all access points, including the old logging road on the north side. She turned to Peggy, who sat nearby in her favorite rocking chair, knitting what appeared to be a sweater, while actually keeping a sharp eye on the security feeds. Mrs. Miller, your property's topography provides excellent natural surveillance advantages. My great-grandfather chose this land carefully, Peggy replied, her needles clicking steadily. He used to say you could see trouble coming from any direction, and there was always a way to outmaneuver it. Marcus Rodriguez, a former Green Beret who had served under James, entered the sugar house carrying several folders. Got some interesting information on our visitors, he announced, spreading photographs across a table. That Michael Stone who threatened you. His real name is Michael Stavros, former Army Ranger turned mercenary. He's been linked to several organized criminal operations, but nothing ever sticks. Peggy studied the photographs, her keen eyes taking in details. The man who warned him about movement on the satellite road. He had a distinctive scar on his left hand. Like a burn, Marcus nodded appreciatively. Good eye, Mrs. Miller. That's Eric Walsh, former EOD specialist. Got that scar defusing an IED in Iraq. Went off the grid after his discharge, surfaced running protection for various criminal enterprises. Sarah pulled up additional files on her computer. The pattern matches what we've seen in other regions. They identify vulnerable targets, usually elderly property owners, isolated locations, high-value land. They start with legitimate offers through front companies, then escalate to intimidation when they're refused. But why here? Peggy asked, her needles pausing. This valley has plenty of farms, many owned by elderly folks like myself. Why target us specifically? Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. We think we know, Sarah said carefully. Your property sits on what geologists call a strategic resource corridor. Initial surveys suggest significant deposits of rare earth elements essential for advanced technology manufacturing. Minerals under my potato fields and maple groves? Peggy's surprise was evident. Yes, ma'am, Marcus confirmed. And with current market values, those deposits are worth far more than any agricultural use. We believe Stavros's group is working for a larger organization, one with connections to international technology firms. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from one of the monitors. Vehicle approaching, Sarah announced, switching to a camera showing the main road. Unknown pickup truck. 2 occupants. That's Samuel Henderson, Peggy said, recognizing the battered blue truck. His family's farm was burned last month. The poor man's been staying with his daughter in Burlington. They watched as the elderly farmer and a younger woman parked in front of the house. Marcus moved to intercept them, while Sarah ran background checks. 5 minutes later, they were all gathered in Peggy's kitchen, Samuel Henderson's weathered face lined with worry as he told his story. They came just like they came to you, Peggy, Samuel said, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. All politeness at first, talking about retirement and fair market value. When we refused, things started happening. Equipment failures, livestock getting sick, feed deliveries getting mixed up. Then the fire. He paused, emotion choking his voice. 3 generations of Hendersons worked that land. Now it's gone. His daughter, Anne Henderson Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, added, "The police investigation went nowhere. The insurance company found inconclusive evidence of arson. 2 weeks later, we had no choice but to sell. The price they offered barely covered our debts." Sarah was taking notes while simultaneously running searches on her laptop. "Mr. Henderson, did you deal with Michael Stavros directly?" "No, different fellow, but same approach. Called himself James Wilson. Looked more like a banker than a biker, but the threats were the same." Marcus pulled up a photograph on his tablet. "Was this him?" Samuel leaned forward, squinting slightly. "Yes, that's him." "Who is he, really?" "Richard Knox," Marcus replied. "Former CIA operations officer, cashiered out for unauthorized activities. He's been linked to several corporate espionage cases." Anne Henderson Walsh straightened in her chair. "Are you saying this is bigger than just farm acquisitions? That there's some kind of organized operation targeting properties in the valley?" "That's exactly what we're saying," Sarah confirmed. "And your father's experience helps confirm our analysis. They're methodical, professional, and well-connected. They've done this before, probably many times." Peggy set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. "Samuel, how many other farmers in the valley have been approached?" "At least 5 that I know of," he replied. "The Robertsons sold after their cattle got sick. The Whitakers are holding out, but their equipment keeps breaking down mysteriously. Old Bill Collins had his irrigation system sabotaged right before a dry spell, lost his entire crop." Sarah was rapidly entering data into her system. "This fits the pattern we've seen in other regions. They isolate their targets, create financial pressure through orchestrated accidents, then swoop in with lowball offers when the owners are desperate." "But why go to such elaborate lengths?" Anne asked. "Why not just make legitimate offers?" Marcus exchanged glances with Sarah before responding. "Because what they're really after isn't public knowledge. The mineral deposits under these farms, they're trying to acquire the rights quietly before anyone realizes their true value. They're also counting on their targets being isolated and vulnerable," Sarah added. "Elderly farmers living alone, limited connections to law enforcement or legal resources. No offense," she smiled at Peggy, "but they don't expect their victims to have access to military-grade security and intelligence resources. Or to have a grandson in special forces," Peggy said proudly. "James always said my stubbornness would get me in trouble one day. I suppose it finally has." "Your stubbornness might just be what breaks this whole operation open," Marcus replied. "We've been tracking similar activities across 3 states, but this is the first time we've had a chance to catch them in the act. They made a serious mistake targeting you, Mrs. Miller." A quiet alert sounded from Sarah's laptop. "Movement on the satellite road," she announced, pulling up thermal imaging. 2 vehicles moving slow, lights off. Everyone tensed, but Peggy remained calm, reaching for her knitting. "Right on schedule," she said. "They're doing reconnaissance, trying to understand my routines, looking for vulnerabilities." "They'll find none," Marcus assured her, speaking quietly into his radio. "All teams, maintain concealment. Let them conduct their survey. We want them to think they're dealing with a single elderly woman." They watched on the monitors as 2 dark SUVs crept along the back road that bordered Peggy's property. Thermal imaging showed 4 occupants in each vehicle, their movements precise and coordinated. "Military training," Sarah observed. "The way, they're maintaining intervals, checking sightlines. These aren't ordinary criminals." "No," Marcus agreed grimly. They're professionals, which means they'll be thorough in their planning. They won't move against the property until they're confident in their intelligence. How long? Peggy asked, her knitting needles never faltering. Based on similar operations, they'll conduct surveillance for 3 to 5 days, Sarah replied. They're arrogant but not careless. They'll want to establish patterns, identify any security measures, plan their approach. Good, Peggy said with a slight smile. That gives us time to spring our own surprise. Samuel, would you be willing? To help us set a trap for these people, to stop them from doing to other farms what they did to yours. The elderly farmer straightened in his chair, a spark of determination in his eyes. Just tell me what you need, Peggy. It's time someone stood up to these bullies. And Henderson Walsh leaned forward. I have contacts at the State Attorney General's office. If we can gather enough evidence. That's exactly what we plan to do, Marcus confirmed. But first, we need to let them think their intimidation is working. Mrs. Miller, how do you feel about appearing vulnerable and frightened for the next few days? Peggy's smile turned shrewd. Young man, I was acting in amateur theater before you were born. I believe I can manage a convincing performance of a scared old woman. As if to emphasize her point, one of the monitors showed the SUVs pulling away, their occupants presumably satisfied with their initial reconnaissance. They'll be back, Sarah said, tracking the vehicles on her system. Next time, they'll probably test our response times, see how long it takes for help to arrive if they stage an incident. Then we'll be ready, Marcus assured everyone. They think they're dealing with an easy target. They have no idea they're walking into a trap set by some of the most experienced special operations veterans in the country. Samuel Henderson stared at the monitors, watching the SUVs disappear into the night. To think, all this was going on, and none of us knew the real reason. All those farms lost. Not anymore, Peggy said firmly. 5 generations of Millers have worked this land. I won't be the one to lose it to criminals and corporations. And maybe, just maybe, we can help other farmers understand what they're really up against. Outside, the October wind rustled through the maple trees, their leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold. To any observer, Miller Farm appeared peaceful, unchanging, vulnerable. But beneath that tranquil surface, a sophisticated operation was taking shape, one that would soon teach Michael Stavros and his organization a costly lesson about underestimating their opponents. Dawn broke over Miller Farm with a deceptive calm, frost glittering on the pumpkin fields as Peggy Miller went about her morning routine. She shuffled slightly slower than usual along her front porch, making sure the security cameras caught her, apparent frailty. Her movements deliberately unsteady as she collected the morning paper. Their surveillance of the previous night had revealed at least 2 observation points, where Stavros's team was likely monitoring the property. Perfect performance, Mrs. Miller. Sarah's voice came quietly through her earpiece. Thermal imaging shows 2 observers in the tree line. They're buying the frightened elderly woman act completely. Peggy allowed her hand to tremble visibly as she fumbled with her porch door, playing up the vulnerability their opponents expected to see. Inside, her kitchen had become an unlikely fusion of farmhouse comfort and tactical operations center. Marcus Rodriguez sat at her wooden table, apparently enjoying coffee and homemade muffins, while actually coordinating the positions of 12 former Special Forces operators concealed around the property. Movement on the satellite road, Sarah, reported from the Sugar House Command Center. Vehicle approaching, red pickup truck, matches description of local contractor vehicles they've used in other operations. Right on schedule, Marcus commented, watching the monitors they'd discreetly installed in the kitchen. They'll try to establish a legitimate-looking presence first. Get eyes inside the house. The truck pulled into Peggy's driveway, and a man in work clothes stepped out carrying a toolbox. His costume was convincing, but his movement patterns betrayed military training to experienced observers. "Mrs. Miller?" he called out as he approached the porch. "Frank Wilson from Valley Electric. We've had reports of power fluctuations in this area. Just doing courtesy checks for our elderly customers." Peggy opened her door, leaning heavily on her cane. "Oh, how thoughtful, though I haven't noticed any problems with my electricity." "Better safe than sorry, Mom." The man smiled professionally. "These old houses can have wiring issues. Hate to see anything happen to such a beautiful historic property." The implied threat was subtle, but clear. Peggy made a show of hesitating, her voice wavering slightly. "Well, I suppose a quick check wouldn't hurt. My grandson's been after me to have the wiring inspected." "Team 2, maintain positions." Marcus sub-vocalized into his communications device. "Let him conduct his reconnaissance. Sarah, you getting?" "Clean video. Crystal clear," came the response. "Facial recognition running. Evidence package for each interaction." The fake electrician moved through the house with practiced efficiency, his inspection a thin cover for documenting entry points, security measures, and general layout. Peggy followed him, playing the part of a chatty, slightly confused elderly woman while carefully noting every area he examined. "Your grandson lives with you, Ma'am?" he asked casually, checking a circuit panel. "Oh no, dear. He's in the military, stationed somewhere he can't talk about. Visits when he can, but I manage just fine on my own." Peggy injected just the right note of lonely vulnerability into her voice. The man made a few more cursory checks before declaring everything fine. "Just remember, ma'am, if you notice any problems, flickering lights, burning smells, call us. Immediately, day or night, safety first." After he left, Peggy dropped her frail act, standing straight as she watched the truck depart. "Sarah, analysis? The electrician is Thomas Reed, former Force Recon Marine. Multiple suspected connections to professional intimidation operations in 3 states, but no convictions. They're sending their experienced people. They're also getting impatient," Marcus noted. "This level of direct reconnaissance suggests they're accelerating their timeline." The rest of the morning brought a steady stream of similar visitors: a municipal water quality inspector, a real estate assessor conducting updates for tax purposes, and a census worker verifying demographic information. Each was documented, identified, and added to the growing evidence package Sarah was building. Around noon, the expected escalation began. Peggy was in her garden, making a show of struggling with some fall cleanup, when the roar of motorcycles announced Stavros's return. This time, he brought only 3 riders with him, presenting a less overtly threatening appearance. "Mrs. Miller," he called out, his tone carefully modulated to sound concerned. "I hoped we might continue our conversation from the other day. Have you given any thought to our offer?" Peggy straightened up slowly, leaning on her gardening tools. "Mr. Stone, or should I say, Mr. Stavros, I've been quite upset since your last visit. All this talk of accidents and danger. It's given me terrible anxiety." A flash of satisfaction crossed Stavros's face at her apparent fear. "I understand your concern, ma'am. We don't want to cause you any distress. We're actually here to help protect you. This is a dangerous area for elderly folks. Living alone. Oh, Peggy's voice quavered. Have there been problems? Unfortunately, yes. Just last month, the Henderson place burned down. Such a tragedy. And the Robertson farm lost their entire herd to some mysterious illness. Never know what might happen. These days, Sarah's voice came through Peggy's earpiece. We're recording every word. Keep him talking about the other incidents. Those poor people, Peggy said, wringing her hands. I heard the Hendersons had to sell, and for such a low price too. Sometimes accepting a fair offer is better than risking unfortunate accidents, Stavros said smoothly. Our organization has resources, Mrs. Miller. We can ensure your safety for the right price. I just don't know. Peggy's voice broke slightly. This farm, it's all I have left of my family. My grandson would be so disappointed if I sold. Your grandson isn't here, is he? Stavros stepped closer, his voice dropping. He's not the one who has to worry about falling downstairs or having medical emergencies with no one around to help. We're offering you a comfortable retirement, Mrs. Miller. Safe, secure, well provided for. From the Sugar House Command Center, Sarah and her team documented every word, every gesture, building their case methodically. Marcus maintained radio silence, his teams ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond psychological intimidation. I need time to think, Peggy said, her voice small and frightened. This is such a big decision. Of course, Stavros smiled, though his eyes remained cold. Take all the time you need, until tomorrow evening. After that, well, let's just say the offer might not stay so generous. Accidents become more likely when people make poor choices. After the bikers departed, Peggy immediately straightened up, her vulnerable demeanor vanishing. Sarah, did we get what we needed? Every word, Mrs. Miller. Multiple direct threats, implied connection to previous incidents. They're getting overconfident, sloppy with their language. Marcus emerged from his concealed position near the garden. They'll move soon. That timeline, tomorrow evening, suggests they're planning something overnight. Classic intimidation pattern. Good, Peggy said firmly. The sooner they make their move, the sooner we can end this. Did James's package arrive? Yes, Mom. Special delivery an hour ago. The equipment is being set up now. Inside the sugar house, Sarah showed them the latest surveillance footage. Multiple thermal imaging cameras provided by James through his military connections had been concealed around the property. The sophisticated system could track any movement within a 2-mile radius, day or night. They have 3 observation posts, Sarah pointed out on the displays. Here, here, and here. They're maintaining round-the-clock surveillance, probably planning their approach routes. Response teams, Peggy asked, studying the tactical displays with a sharpness that belied her years. 4 teams of 3, positioned to cover all likely. Approach vectors, Marcus reported. All former special operations handpicked by James. They know their business, ma'am. And our guests are ready? Sarah smiled. The Hendersons have spread the word quietly. 23 local farmers who've been approached or threatened by this organization are standing by. When we give the signal, they'll arrive with full documentation of every interaction, every threat, every accident they've experienced. Plus, our friends from the State Attorney General's office, Marcus added. They're maintaining distance until we have actionable evidence, but they're ready to move fast once we give them what they need. Peggy nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. So now we wait for them to show their hand. Any predictions on their likely approach? Based on their pattern at other farms, they'll probably stage some kind of equipment failure first, Sarah analyzed. Something to create confusion, divide our attention. Then while everyone's distracted, they'll make their main move, Marcus finished. Probably multiple teams, coordinated approach. They like to overwhelm their targets quickly, create a sense of helplessness. Well then, Peggy said, settling into her chair, let's make sure we're ready to give them a proper welcome when they do. Night settled over Miller Farm like a thick blanket, bringing with it a tense anticipation. In the Sugar House Command Center, Sarah Chen watched multiple thermal imaging displays showing regular patrols by Stavros's surveillance teams. The opposition maintained 3 observation posts, their personnel rotating every 4 hours with military precision. They're professional. I'll give them that, Marcus commented, studying the pattern of movements. Regular comms checks, disciplined positions, no obvious gaps in their coverage. Almost like they're expecting resistance, Sarah replied, adjusting one of the cameras. Their operational security is way above what you'd expect for intimidating an elderly farmer. A new alert flashed on one of the monitors. Vehicle approaching from the North Access Road, Sarah announced. Heavy truck, moving slow, lights off. Right. On schedule, Marcus replied. Mrs. Miller, are you ready for your evening performance? Peggy sat in her favorite chair by the window, clearly visible from outside, working on her knitting. Just waiting for my cue, dear. The truck, a large maintenance vehicle, stopped just within view of the house. In the darkness, several figures emerged, moving with practiced stealth toward the farm's main transformer box. They're going to cut power to the house, Sarah predicted. Standard tactic: isolate the target, create confusion, test response times. Little do they know, Marcus smiled grimly. We've got redundant systems on everything. Mrs. Miller, time to appear appropriately distressed. The farm's lights flickered once, twice, then went dark. Peggy immediately began her performance, visible through the window as she fumbled frantically with a flashlight, her movements suggesting panic and confusion. All teams, maintain positions, Marcus commanded through the secure communications network. Let them think their plan is working. Sarah tracked multiple heat signatures approaching the house from different angles. 4-man team moving up the east side, 2 more approaching from the west. They're coordinating their movements. Inside the house, Peggy made a show of calling the power company on her landline, her voice shaking as she reported the outage. The phone, of course, was dead. Another part of their opponent's isolation strategy. Target is isolated, came a voice over their intercepted communications. No response from emergency services. Phase 2 is a go. Here they come, Sarah announced. Multiple approaches, well coordinated. They're not being subtle anymore. The sound of breaking glass shattered the night's silence, a carefully calculated act of intimidation. Peggy screamed, exactly as expected of a frightened elderly woman, and fled upstairs, leaving the lights off. Mrs. Miller's performance should win an Oscar, Sarah commented, watching the thermal signatures converge on the house. They're completely buying it. All teams hold positions, Marcus commanded. Let them commit fully to the operation. Through their surveillance systems, they watched as more figures emerged from the darkness. Michael Stavros himself approached the front door, accompanied by 6 others. The back door was similarly covered. Mr. Knox has arrived, Sarah reported, identifying another heat signature. Looks like they brought the whole command team. Perfect, Marcus replied. The more the better. All evidence collection systems running? Everything's being recorded. Multiple angles, audio, thermal. They're not walking away from this one. Inside the house, Peggy had retreated to her bedroom, maintaining her frightened elderly woman act as heavy footsteps moved through the rooms below. The intruders were methodical, professional, checking each room with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Miller," Stavros's voice called out, falsely gentle. "We know you're here. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. We just want to talk." "Phase 3 is starting," Sarah reported, noting new vehicle movements. "Support teams arriving with their cleanup equipment." "Record everything," Marcus commanded. "We need solid evidence of their full operational pattern." Through their surveillance systems, they watched as 3 more vehicles arrived. Unmarked vans carrying equipment typically used to stage accidents. Fire accelerants, tools for damaging infrastructure, everything needed to create plausible, catastrophic failures. "But please," Peggy called out, her voice trembling perfectly. "Don't hurt me. I'll sign whatever you want." "Smart lady," Stavros replied. "We'll make this quick and painless. Just a few signatures and you can retire in comfort. Never worry about maintaining this big old place again." "Teams in position," Marcus sub-vocalized. "Waiting for final commitment." More. Footsteps on the stairs. Stavros and 2 others approached Peggy's bedroom, while teams below began placing their accident preparation materials. "Mrs. Miller," Stavros called through the door. "We're coming in. Stay calm, and everything will be fine." The door opened, revealing Peggy sitting on her bed, apparently terrified, clutching a manila envelope. "The papers," she said shakily. "The ones you wanted me to sign. I have them ready." Stavros smiled, genuine satisfaction crossing his face. "I knew you'd make the right choice. So much easier than the messy alternatives." "Indeed," Peggy replied, her voice suddenly strong and clear. "Speaking of alternatives, I believe it's time for Plan B." The lights blazed on throughout the house, momentarily disorienting the intruders. Simultaneously, powerful floodlights illuminated the entire property, eliminating any concealment for the teams outside. "What the—" Stavros began, but froze as he found himself confronted by Marcus and 2 other operators, weapons trained and steady. "Michael Stavros," Marcus announced formally. "You and your associates are being detained as part of an ongoing federal investigation into organized criminal activities." Outside, similar scenes played out as concealed teams revealed themselves, surrounding the support vehicles and their personnel. The operation had been coordinated with precision, catching the entire organization in the act. "You have no authority," Stavros snarled, recovering his composure. "This is a private business." "Matter, actually," came a new voice, as Ann Henderson Walsh stepped into view, holding up her credentials. "The State Attorney General's office has a very keen interest in your business matters, particularly your connection to multiple cases of organized intimidation, property damage, and suspected arson." More vehicles were arriving now, official ones. State police, FBI agents, and representatives from multiple agencies converged on the property, their timing coordinated to perfection. Additionally, Peggy added, standing straight and confident, "Every moment of your operation has been recorded. Every threat, every action, all coordinated with evidence from multiple other properties you've targeted." Sarah's voice came through their communication system. "All subjects contained, evidence collection teams moving in. We've got them, complete operational documentation." "This is a misunderstanding," Richard Knox tried, maintaining his professional demeanor. We're legitimate business people conducting normal negotiations. Normal negotiations don't usually involve night raids and staged accidents, Marcus replied dryly. You made a serious mistake targeting this farm. Mrs. Miller isn't quite the vulnerable elderly widow you thought. As if to emphasize his point, more vehicles arrived. Pickup trucks and family cars carrying dozens of local farmers, each one bearing documentation of similar threats and incidents on their properties. You see, Peggy said, addressing Stavros directly, when you threaten one farmer in this valley, you threaten all of us, and some of us have resources you didn't expect. The scale of the operation became clear to the criminals as they watched. Their carefully planned intimidation scheme collapse. State police evidence teams were already documenting the materials in their vehicles, while federal agents began conducting preliminary interviews with the gathered farmers. This goes beyond simple property crimes, Ann Henderson Walsh announced. We're looking at RICO violations, conspiracy, multiple counts of extortion, and attempted arson. The state attorney general is particularly interested in the pattern of organized intimidation targeting elderly property owners. Sarah emerged from the command center carrying multiple hard drives. We have everything. Complete surveillance coverage of their entire operation, plus correlating evidence from other targeted properties. Their whole methodology is documented. Stavros maintained his cold composure, but Knox was visibly shaken. Their organization had operated with impunity for years, protected by careful planning and professional execution. They had never expected to encounter this level of sophisticated counter-operation. One question, Marcus said to Stavros. The mineral surveys, the rare earth deposits, how did you identify the target properties? Stavros remained silent, but Knox's expression revealed the truth. Government geological surveys, Sarah answered for them. They had access to classified reports through their connections. That's how they knew which properties to target. Adding unauthorized use of classified information to the charges, Anne noted, updating her preliminary report, along with evidence of corruption in multiple agencies. This is going to be a very interesting investigation. As dawn approached, Miller Farm hummed with activity. Evidence teams worked methodically, documenting everything. Local farmers provided statements about their experiences with the criminal organization. State and federal agents coordinated jurisdiction and charges. Peggy Miller stood on her porch, watching as Stavros and his associates were led away in handcuffs. You know, she said to Marcus, I don't think this is quite what they expected. When they decided to pressure a helpless old woman, the aftermath of the night's operation transformed Miller Farm into a hub of intense investigative activity. Local and state police, FBI agents, and representatives from multiple agencies worked methodically to document every aspect of the criminal enterprise they had exposed. In the farm's spacious kitchen, now serving as an impromptu briefing room, Ann Henderson Walsh coordinated with federal prosecutors, while farmers from across the valley provided detailed statements about their encounters with Stavros's organization. The pattern is consistent across all cases, Ann explained, spreading documents across Peggy's well-worn kitchen table. They identified properties with specific geological characteristics, approached with legitimate-seeming offers, then escalated to systematic intimidation when owners refused to sell. Sarah Chen operated from her command center in the sugar house, correlating electronic evidence with witness statements. Their operational security was professional grade, she reported. Encrypted communications, counter-surveillance measures, military-style protocols. This goes way beyond simple real estate fraud. Marcus Rodriguez entered the kitchen, having completed a thorough property sweep with his teams. Found 3 more surveillance devices they'd planted around the perimeter. High-end stuff, government contractor grade. Someone was bankrolling them with serious resources. Peggy sat in her familiar rocking chair, serving coffee to the steady stream of officials and farmers while maintaining a watchful eye on the proceedings. The contrast between her apparent grandmotherly demeanor and her role in orchestrating the operation's success was not lost on anyone present. Mrs. Miller, a FBI agent, approached, notepad in hand. "We need to go over the timeline of your interactions with Stavros and his associates. When did you first suspect they were part of an organized criminal enterprise?" "The moment they arrived," Peggy replied, pouring more coffee. "My husband Thomas was a Korean War veteran. He taught me to recognize military bearing, even when disguised. These men moved like soldiers, not real estate developers." Samuel Henderson, still processing the night's events, sat nearby, providing his own statement. "They used the same tactics at every farm," he explained. "First the friendly approach, then the mysterious accidents, then the pressure to sell when we were vulnerable. We just never connected the incidents until now." A state police evidence technician entered, carrying several tablets and laptops recovered from the criminals' vehicles. "Ma'am, the encryption on these devices is sophisticated, military-grade security protocols." "Give those to Sarah," Marcus directed. "She has experience with similar systems from her intelligence work." The investigation expanded as more farmers arrived, each bringing documentation of threats, suspicious accidents, and pressure tactics. A pattern emerged of a highly organized operation targeting specific properties across multiple states. "The mineral surveys were the key," Anne explained, reviewing geological reports. "They used classified government studies to identify properties with valuable rare earth deposits. Then they created a systematic approach to acquiring these properties at below-market rates." "But why such elaborate methods?" asked one of the federal agents. "Why not just make legitimate offers based on the mineral values?" "Because they needed to keep the deposits secret," Sarah answered, looking up from her computer. "If word got out about the rare earth elements, property values would skyrocket. Other buyers would move in. They needed to acquire the land quietly, using pressure tactics to force quick sales." Throughout the morning, evidence teams documented the sophisticated equipment found in the criminals' vehicles, specialized surveillance gear, tools for staging accidents, even materials for creating natural disasters that could pressure property owners to sell. "Look at this," Marcus called, examining one of the vans. "They have the same accelerant traces that were found at the Henderson farm after the fire. Direct connection to the arson cases." Anne immediately dispatched a forensics team to process the evidence. This ties them directly to multiple property crimes across 3 states. The Attorney General's office will be very interested in these findings. In the Sugar House Command Center, Sarah worked to decrypt the seized devices. They were thorough in covering their tracks, but they didn't expect this level of counter-surveillance. We have recordings of their entire operational planning, including direct orders for intimidation and property damage. A quiet conversation in the corner of the kitchen caught Peggy's attention. 2 FBI agents were discussing financial traces that linked the criminal organization to several technology manufacturing companies. "The corporate connections are what make this truly significant," Anne explained to the gathered investigators. "These weren't just independent criminals. They were working for larger interests, companies that needed these mineral rights for Manufacturing advanced technology. Samuel Henderson shook his head in disbelief. All this time, we thought we were just small farmers being pushed out by developers. Never imagined we were sitting on resources worth millions. That's exactly what they counted on, Marcus noted. They targeted people they thought wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. They never expected to run into someone like Mrs. Miller. Peggy smiled slightly, continuing to rock in her chair. They forgot that age brings wisdom, and wisdom teaches us to look beneath the surface of things. My grandson James always said my stubborn streak would prove useful someday. By early afternoon, the initial phase of evidence collection was complete. The State Attorney General's office had enough documentation to proceed with multiple criminal charges, while federal agencies began expanding their investigation into the corporate connections behind the operation. Mrs. Miller, Anne approached, with a thick folder. We'll need you to review and sign these statements. Your testimony will be crucial in connecting all the elements of this case. As Peggy read through the documents, more farmers arrived, drawn by word of mouth about the operation's success. Each brought their own stories of intimidation and pressure, adding to the growing body of evidence against Stavros's organization. It's like a weightlifting, Samuel Henderson said, watching another evidence team photograph the equipment found in the criminals' vehicles. Knowing we weren't alone, that others faced the same threats, and now, finally, something's being done about it. Sarah emerged from the sugar house with preliminary results from her analysis. The encrypted communications reveal a network extending far beyond this valley. Similar operations in multiple states, all targeting properties with specific mineral deposits. This is just one cell of a much larger organization. The implications of her discovery sparked intense discussion among the gathered law enforcement officials. What had begun as an investigation into local property crimes was expanding into something much broader, with potential national security implications. The rare earth elements they were targeting, Sarah explained, pulling up geological surveys on her laptop. They're essential for manufacturing advanced technology, everything from smartphones to military equipment. Control of these resources has significant strategic value. Marcus, who had been coordinating with other veteran operators around the perimeter, joined the discussion, which explains the level of sophistication in their operation. This wasn't just about real estate, it was about controlling strategic resources. The autumn sun began to set over the valley, casting long shadows across Miller Farm. The day's activities were winding down, but the investigation was just beginning. Evidence teams packed up their equipment while state and federal agents prepared to transport their prisoners to secure facilities. What happens now? Samuel Henderson asked, watching the procession of vehicles leaving the farm. Now, Anne replied, organizing her files, we build our case. Multiple criminal charges, civil suits to recover damages, and a broader investigation into the corporate interests behind this operation. This is just the beginning. Peggy Miller stood on her porch, watching the sunset paint the maple trees. In brilliant colors, her farm had become the focal point of something much larger than a simple property dispute, but she felt no regret for her role in exposing the criminal enterprise. You know, she said to Marcus as he joined her on the porch, Thomas always said this land would protect us if we protected it. I never quite understood what he meant until now. Behind them, Sarah continued her work in the sugar house, uncovering more connections and evidence. The night's operation had succeeded beyond their expectations, not just in stopping immediate threats, but in revealing a much larger conspiracy that had preyed on vulnerable farmers across multiple states. The impromptu gathering of farmers began to disperse, each carrying new hope and determination. What had started as one elderly woman's refusal to be intimidated had transformed into a movement of rural solidarity, exposing corruption and criminality that had haunted their communities for years. The following morning dawned crisp and clear over Miller Farm, but the peaceful autumn scene belied the intense activity taking place inside. The farmhouse kitchen had transformed into a command center for the expanding investigation, with Sarah Chen coordinating data analysis, while Anne Henderson Walsh managed an increasing flow of witness statements and evidence reports. The encryption on their communication devices is yielding significant intelligence, Sarah announced, eyes fixed on her multiple screens. We've identified operational cells in 7 states, all following the same pattern of targeting properties, with specific mineral deposits. Marcus Rodriguez entered from his perimeter check, carrying fresh coffee for the team. State police just reported 3 more farmers came forward in the Northern Valley. Same tactics, same pressure points. They're ready to provide sworn statements. Peggy Miller sat at her kitchen table, reviewing photographs of equipment recovered from the criminals' vehicles. These tools, she pointed to several specialized items. Thomas had similar ones in his military gear. They're designed for covert operations, not ordinary construction work. Correct, Marcus confirmed. Most of this equipment is restricted to military and law enforcement use. Someone with significant connections was supplying them. Anne spread a map across the table, marking locations of known incidents. The pattern follows geological survey. Lines exactly. Every property they targeted sits on verified rare earth deposits. The question is, how did they access classified geological data? I might have an answer for that, Sarah called from her workstation. I've traced several encrypted communications to an IP address within the U.S. Geological Survey Office. They had someone on the inside. The investigation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What began as a response to local intimidation had uncovered a sophisticated criminal enterprise with connections to government agencies and international technology firms. Mrs. Miller, a FBI agent, approached respectfully. We need to go over your initial contact with Stavros again. There are some patterns we're trying to confirm. Peggy nodded, settling into her narrative. They arrived on motorcycles, presenting an intentionally intimidating appearance. But their formation was military precise. Mr. Stavros spoke like someone used to command, not like a typical criminal. Samuel Henderson, who had returned to help coordinate other farmers' testimonies, added his observations. They were different with each property. With me, they sent men in business suits, very professional. With the Robertsons, they used local contractors as cover. They adapted their approach based on their target. Sarah's computer chimed with an alert, breaking through another encryption layer. They maintained detailed files on every property and owner they targeted. Surveillance reports, psychological profiles, financial vulnerabilities. This was a thoroughly planned operation. That level of intelligence gathering suggests government training, Marcus noted, studying the decrypted files. These aren't ordinary criminals. They're former military or intelligence operators using their skills for private interests. The farmhouse phone rang, James Miller calling for his morning update. Peggy put him on speaker, allowing him to join the investigation. From his classified location, the equipment they were using, James's voice crackled through the speaker, matches what we've seen in corporate espionage cases. High-end surveillance gear, counter-detection systems. Someone invested serious money in this operation. Anne made notes as James spoke. The corporate connection is becoming clearer. We've traced funding through several shell companies linked to technology manufacturers. They were creating a secret supply chain for rare earth elements by forcing elderly farmers to sell at depressed prices, Samuel added bitterly. Using our isolation and vulnerability against us. The investigation continued to expand throughout. The morning, more farmers arrived, each bringing documentation of threats and suspicious incidents. Sarah's analysis revealed patterns linking local intimidation to larger corporate strategies. Look at this timeline. She displayed a chart on her laptop. Every property acquisition coincided with specific technological developments. They were securing resources based on projected manufacturing needs. Marcus, who had been coordinating with other veteran operators in the area, reported new developments. We've identified 3 more surveillance teams operating in adjacent counties. Same equipment, same tactics. This operation goes wider than we thought. The evidence mounting in Peggy's kitchen painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise, masquerading as legitimate business. Corporate interests had employed former military operators to secure valuable resources through intimidation and force, counting on their victims' isolation and lack of resources to prevent exposure. The real genius of their plan, Anne observed, reviewing financial records, was how they kept the mineral deposits secret. By forcing quick sales under pressure, they prevented any proper geological surveys that might have revealed the true value of the land. Sarah's computer beeped again. Breaking news. State police just raided an office in Burlington. Found documents linking the operation to similar activities in 3 other states. This is becoming a multi-jurisdictional investigation. James's voice came through the speaker again. The technology companies involved, they're not just private corporations. Some have contracts with defense agencies. This could have national security implications. The scope of the investigation had grown far beyond what anyone expected when Peggy first refused Stavros's threats. What began as protecting one family farm had exposed a conspiracy involving corporate espionage, government, corruption, and international technology interests. Mrs. Miller, Anne said, reviewing her notes, your refusal to sell, your decision to fight back, it didn't just save your farm. It exposed a criminal enterprise that's been preying on rural communities across multiple states. Peggy continued, rocking in her chair, watching the activity in her kitchen with quiet satisfaction. Sometimes, standing your ground does more than protect your own interests. It shows others they can stand up too. Sarah called everyone's attention to her screens. New data decrypted. They maintained detailed surveillance on potential resistance, local law enforcement, community leaders, anyone who might interfere with their operations. They were thorough in their planning. But they never expected this level of counter-surveillance, Marcus added. They didn't count on facing opponents with equal or superior tactical experience. The investigation's impact rippled through the rural community. More farmers came forward, sharing stories of mysterious accidents, equipment failures, and pressure to sell. Each account added to the growing evidence of organized criminal activity. The pattern is consistent, Anne noted, organizing witness statements. They identified isolated targets, usually elderly property owners or struggling farmers. created financial pressure through orchestrated accidents, then moved in with lowball offers when their victims were vulnerable. Samuel Henderson studied the geological surveys spread across the table. All this time, we thought we were just small farmers being pushed out by progress. Never imagined we were sitting on resources worth millions. That's what they counted on, Marcus replied. Your perceived vulnerability was their operational advantage. They never expected organized resistance. By mid-afternoon, the full scale of the criminal enterprise was becoming clear. Sarah's analysis had uncovered connections to technology firms in multiple countries, all seeking to secure rare earth elements for manufacturing advanced electronics. The corporate structure is deliberately complex, she explained, displaying interconnected diagrams. Shell companies, offshore accounts, multiple layers of separation between the operators and their ultimate employers. Anne's phone rang. The State Attorney General's office calling for an update. The investigation had caught the attention of senior law enforcement officials who recognized its broader implications. This goes beyond ordinary criminal activity, Anne reported after the call. We're looking at potential RICO charges, international corporate espionage, unauthorized use of classified information. Multiple agencies want to be involved. Throughout the day, evidence teams continued processing materials recovered from Stavros's operation. Each new discovery revealed another layer of the conspiracy, another connection to powerful interests who had employed former military operators to secure valuable resources through intimidation and force. The irony, Peggy observed, watching the activity from her rocking chair, is that they chose their targets based on perceived weakness. They never considered that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one they underestimate. As evening approached, Miller Farm became the focal point of an expanding multi-agency operation. The Sugar House Command Center hummed with activity as Sarah Chen coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 3 states, tracking the increasingly complex web of criminal activities they had uncovered. We've identified a pattern in their financial transactions, Sarah announced, pulling up complex diagrams on her screens. Every property acquisition was followed by a series of transfers through offshore accounts, ultimately leading to technology. Manufacturing firms in Asia and Europe. Marcus Rodriguez entered from his latest security sweep, his expression concerned. Just got word from our surveillance teams. There's unusual activity at several other targeted properties. Looks like some of their operators are trying to clean up loose ends. Anne Henderson Walsh immediately began coordinating with state police. We need to secure those locations before they can destroy evidence. How many properties are we talking? About at least 5 in this valley alone, Marcus replied, marking locations on their tactical map, all showing signs of activity similar to what we saw here before the raid. Peggy Miller watched from her position by the window, her sharp eyes noting every detail of the operation unfolding around her. They're running scared, she observed. When criminals start cleaning house, it means we're closer to the truth than they'd like. Sarah's computer chimed with an urgent alert. Incoming data from the Burlington raid. They found documentation linking the operation to a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, all connected to a single holding company, Global Resource Development Limited. That name means something to you? Anne asked, noting Sarah's intense focus. It should. James Miller's voice came through the secure line they'd established. Global Resource Development is a front company we've encountered in military intelligence. They're suspected of orchestrating resource acquisition operations in multiple countries. The investigation had expanded far beyond their initial expectations. What began as a response to local intimidation had uncovered an international conspiracy involving corporate espionage, illegal resource acquisition, and the exploitation of vulnerable property owners. Mrs. Miller, a senior FBI agent, approached. "The group, we need to move quickly on this. Our analysts believe there may be retaliatory actions planned against witnesses who've come forward." "Already ahead of you," Marcus responded, activating his tactical communications. "We've got teams moving to secure key locations and protect potential targets. These people won't get a chance to silence anyone." Samuel Henderson, who had been helping coordinate with other affected farmers, entered with new information. "3 more families just contacted me. They were approached last week by men claiming to represent investment groups. Same pattern, same pressure tactics." Sarah immediately began cross-referencing the new information. The geological surveys show their properties sit on the same mineral vein that runs through this valley. They're still actively targeting resources, even with their main operation compromised, because they're desperate. Anne concluded, reviewing the evidence. "These rare earth deposits are crucial for manufacturing advanced technology. Without them, billion-dollar production contracts are at risk." Peggy's kitchen had transformed into an impromptu strategic command center. Maps and documents covered every surface, while multiple laptops displayed real-time surveillance feeds from properties across the valley. "Look at this," Sarah called, highlighting a series of encrypted messages. "They're not just after the minerals. The documents show plans for infrastructure development, processing facilities, transportation networks, even private security forces. They were planning to turn this entire valley into a secret resource extraction operation." Marcus studied the tactical implications. "That explains the level of force they were willing to use. This wasn't just about acquiring property. They were establishing a covert supply chain for strategic materials. Using intimidation and violence against elderly farmers as their acquisition method," Samuel added bitterly, "counting on our isolation and lack of resources to prevent any organized resistance." Anne's phone rang. The Attorney General's office calling with updates. "The federal task force is being expanded," she reported after the call. "They're bringing in specialists from multiple agencies. This case has implications for national security." Throughout the evening, more evidence emerged of the operation's scope. Sarah's analysis revealed connections to technology firms in multiple countries, all desperately seeking to secure supplies of rare earth elements for manufacturing advanced electronics. "The corporate structure is deliberately complex," she explained, displaying intricate relationship diagrams. "Shell companies, offshore accounts, multiple layers of separation between the operators and their ultimate employers. Classic intelligence. Tradecraft applied to corporate resource acquisition. A state police detective arrived with new information from their investigation of the Henderson farm fire. Forensics confirmed the accelerant traces match materials found in Stavros's vehicles. We can now directly link them to multiple acts of arson across 3 states. Add that to the evidence package," Anne directed. "Every connection we establish strengthens the RICO case we're building. These aren't isolated incidents. This is a pattern of organized criminal activity." James's voice came through their secure line again. "The technology companies involved, some of them have sensitive defense contracts. By controlling these mineral resources, they could influence military procurement decisions worth billions. Peggy absorbed this information with her characteristic calm. So our little farms became pawns in an international game of corporate warfare, all because we happened to be sitting on valuable rocks, resources they desperately needed, Marcus confirmed. The rare earth elements under these properties are essential for manufacturing everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. Controlling the supply means controlling the market. Sarah's surveillance systems detected new movement in the valley. Vehicle convoys moving on back roads, multiple SUVs similar to Stavros's operation. They're probably trying to evacuate remaining personnel and equipment. Not this time, Marcus responded, coordinating with his teams. State police have roadblocks on all major routes. Local departments are covering the secondary roads. Nobody's slipping away tonight. Anne reviewed the growing evidence package. We've got them from multiple angles now. Criminal intimidation, arson, conspiracy, corporate espionage, unauthorized use of classified information. The real question is how high up the corporate chain the investigation will reach. All the way to the top, Sarah predicted, still analyzing decoded communications. These operations weren't conducted by rogue elements. The evidence shows clear command and control from corporate leadership. They knew exactly what they were authorizing. As midnight approached, Miller Farm remained a hive of activity. Evidence teams continued processing materials while investigators coordinated operations across multiple jurisdictions. What had begun as one elderly woman's stand against intimidation had evolved into a major federal investigation. Mrs. Miller, the FBI supervisor, approached with fresh coffee. I hope you realize what you've helped uncover here. This case could change how we approach corporate resource acquisition and rural property rights. Peggy smiled slightly, accepting the coffee. Sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to simply turn on the lights. These people counted on their victims staying quiet, staying afraid. They never expected us to stand together. Samuel Henderson, who had remained to help coordinate with other farmers, nodded in agreement. They thought they could pick us off one by one. Instead, they brought us together. Now everyone knows what's really happening in this valley. Sarah's systems continued monitoring valley-wide activity, tracking multiple attempts by remaining criminal elements to cover their tracks. But with law enforcement on high alert and local communities now aware of their tactics, their options were rapidly diminishing. It's not just about stopping this one operation, Anne explained, organizing case files. This investigation will lead to new protections for rural property owners, new oversight of corporate resource acquisition, new attention to the vulnerabilities these criminals exploited. Marcus, returning from another coordination meeting with tactical teams, added his perspective. They chose their targets based on perceived weakness: isolated elderly farmers, struggling family operations. Instead, they found strength they never expected. Outside, the autumn night was clear and cold, stars bright over the peaceful valley. But beneath that tranquil surface, a major operation continued unfolding, systematically dismantling a criminal enterprise that had preyed on vulnerable communities across multiple states. Dawn broke over Miller Farm with renewed urgency as reports arrived of coordinated police raids across 3 states. Sarah Chen's command center in the Sugar House had expanded. Additional screens showing live updates from multiple operations targeting Stavros's organization and their corporate connections. Simultaneous raids executed at 14 locations, Sarah reported, tracking the operations. State police and FBI teams are securing offices, storage facilities, and safe houses linked to their resource acquisition network. Marcus Rodriguez coordinated with tactical teams providing security for key witnesses. 3 more families from the valley have come forward with documentation. Properties targeted, threats received, suspicious accidents, all following the same pattern. N. Henderson Walsh worked with federal prosecutors, building their case methodically. The evidence trail is solid. Financial records show direct links between corporate entities and the intimidation operations. They weren't even trying to hide their connections. They were so confident in their security measures. Peggy Miller sat at her kitchen table, reviewing photographs from other targeted properties. The damage patterns are identical, she observed, comparing images of equipment failures and structural problems. They used the same methods everywhere, just like they planned to use here. Because they were professionals, Marcus explained. Military precision, standardized procedures. They treated this like a tactical operation, not a criminal enterprise. Sarah's systems pinged with new alerts. Breaking through another layer of encrypted communications, they maintained detailed assessments of every property they targeted. Soil samples, mineral content analysis, even projected extraction costs, all using classified geological data. Anne added, examining the documents. They had access to government surveys that were never made public. That's how they identified the most valuable deposits. Samuel Henderson arrived with more farmers from neighboring communities, each bringing evidence of their encounters with the criminal organization. They approached the Collins farm yesterday, he reported. Same tactics, same pressure points. But this time, we were ready. The investigation had revealed a pattern of systematic exploitation. The criminal enterprise used sophisticated intelligence gathering to identify valuable properties, then employed military-style tactics to force acquisitions at fraction of their true worth. The technology companies behind this, Sarah explained, displaying corporate connection diagrams. They're not just after random resources. These rare earth elements are crucial for specific manufacturing processes. Without them, their production capabilities are severely limited. James Miller's voice came through their secure line, adding military context. These minerals are strategic resources. Control of the supply chain has national security implications. That's why they were willing to invest so heavily in securing these properties. Anne's phone buzzed with updates from the ongoing raids. Teams in Burlington just seized another cache of documents, financial records, operational plans, surveillance reports. They documented everything. Overconfidence, Marcus noted. They were so certain of their security measures, they never considered their own documentation could be used against them. The farmhouse kitchen continued serving as their central coordination point, with investigators from multiple agencies sharing information and planning next steps. The scale of the operation had grown far beyond anything they'd initially anticipated. Latest analysis from the geological surveys, Sarah announced, pulling up detailed maps. The mineral deposits under these properties form a continuous vein. They weren't just acquiring random farms. They were systematically securing an entire resource corridor. Local law enforcement reported increased activity on back roads throughout the valley. They're trying to evacuate remaining personnel, Marcus observed, tracking the movements. But with roadblocks in place and surveillance coverage, they're running out of options. Peggy watched the operations unfold with quiet satisfaction. They thought we were helpless, she remarked, pouring coffee for the busy investigators. Isolated elderly farmers, easy targets for intimidation. They never expected this level of resistance. Sarah's computer chimed with another breakthrough. Found their command and control protocols. They used military-grade communication systems, probably supplied through defense contractor connections. Every operation was centrally coordinated, which means we can trace the authorization chain, Anne added, making notes. Every threat, every act of sabotage, every forced sale, it all leads back to corporate leadership. The evidence collection teams continued processing materials recovered from multiple raids. Each new discovery reinforced the connection between local intimidation tactics and international corporate interests. Look at these equipment requisition forms, Marcus said, examining seized documents. High-end surveillance gear, specialized tools for staged accidents, even materials for creating natural disasters, all requisitioned through legitimate-seeming companies. Samuel Henderson studied thermal imaging displays showing movement throughout the valley. More vehicles on the back roads, he reported. They're still trying to salvage something from their operation. Let them try, Sarah responded, monitoring multiple surveillance feeds. Every movement they make adds to our documentation. They're only strengthening the case against themselves. Anne received another call from federal prosecutors. They're expanding the investigation to include corporate leadership, she announced after hanging up. Search warrants are being prepared for offices in 3 countries. The operation had evolved from protecting individual farms to exposing an international conspiracy. Corporate interests had employed former military operators to secure valuable resources through intimidation and force, counting on their victims' isolation to prevent exposure. The real irony, Peggy observed, watching teams process evidence in her yard, is that they chose this valley because we seemed vulnerable. Instead, they found a community ready to stand together. Sarah's analysis revealed more connections between corporate entities and criminal activities. The shell companies, the front organizations, the legitimate-seeming business entities. It's all carefully structured to hide their true operations. Classic intelligence tradecraft, Marcus noted, reviewing the organizational charts. Multiple layers of deniability between the operators and their employers, but they never expected this level of counterintelligence. Throughout the morning, more farmers arrived to provide statements and evidence. Each account added to the growing picture of systematic exploitation targeting rural communities across multiple states. The pattern is always the same, Samuel explained to federal investigators. First the friendly approach, then the mysterious accidents, then the pressure to sell when we're most vulnerable. They knew exactly how to break people down, and coordinated with prosecutors to protect witnesses who had come forward. We're arranging security for everyone who provides testimony. These people have shown they're willing to use violence to protect their interests. Not anymore, Marcus assured her. Their operational structure is compromised, their methods exposed. They've lost the advantage of secrecy they relied on. Peggy's farmhouse had become the heart of a major federal investigation. Her kitchen, table covered with evidence of criminal activities reaching far beyond their rural valley. What began as her refusal to be intimidated had evolved into something much larger. Mrs. Miller, a federal agent, approached with fresh files. Your stand against these people didn't just save your farm. It exposed a criminal enterprise that's been operating across multiple states for years. Sarah continued monitoring communications throughout the region. More activity on encrypted channels, she reported. They're trying to coordinate some kind of response, but their command structure is breaking down because they never planned for this level of exposure, Marcus explained. Their whole operation depended on isolating their targets, preventing any organized resistance. Now that communities are working together, their tactical advantage is gone. The autumn sun climbed higher over the valley as the investigation continued expanding. Each hour brought new discoveries, new connections, new evidence of how deeply the criminal enterprise had penetrated rural communities. The scale of their operation is staggering, Anne commented, reviewing financial records. Millions invested in equipment, personnel, front companies, all to force elderly farmers off their land without revealing the true value of their properties. The afternoon brought a dramatic escalation as state police tactical teams moved against multiple locations identified through Sarah's analysis. Miller Farm's Sugar House Command Center tracked the coordinated operations in real time. Multiple screens showing simultaneous raids across the valley. Teams breaching storage facility on Route 7, Sarah reported, monitoring police communications. Heavy equipment inside, matching descriptions from other property damage incidents. They're seizing everything. Marcus coordinated security for the growing number of witnesses arriving at the farm. 3 more families from the North Valley just arrived with documentation. Same tactics used against their properties, same pressure points targeted. The pattern is consistent across all cases, Anne noted, organizing new evidence files. Initial approach through legitimate-seeming businesses, followed by escalating intimidation when owners refuse to sell. Professional psychological warfare applied against rural communities. Peggy worked in her kitchen, preparing coffee and sandwiches for the steady stream of investigators and witnesses, while keenly observing every development. The coffee pot at our church suppers sees less action than this, she remarked, but her eyes remained sharp and focused. Sarah's systems registered new alerts. Movement on their encrypted channels, multiple vehicles converging on a location east of here. Looks like they're trying to evacuate a secondary command post we hadn't identified. Tactical teams are already moving to intercept, Marcus confirmed, speaking into his secure radio. State police have air support coming in. They won't get far. Anne's phone buzzed with updates from the federal task force. Burlington office just seized another cache of documents. Financial records showing direct payments between technology companies and members of Stavros's organization. The corporate connection is confirmed. Through their surveillance systems, they watched as law enforcement teams systematically dismantled the criminal enterprise's infrastructure. Storage facilities, safe houses, and command centers that had operated in shadow for years were now exposed and neutralized. These people had everything planned out, Samuel Henderson observed, watching the operations unfold. Equipment for staging, accidents, materials for creating natural disasters, even detailed psychological profiles of their targets. They left nothing to chance. Sarah's analysis continued, revealing new layers of the conspiracy. The corporate structure is fascinating, she commented, displaying complex organizational charts. Shell companies nested within shell companies, all designed to obscure the connection between operators and their employers. Classic intelligence tactics applied to corporate resource acquisition, Marcus explained. They used military-grade operational security to hide criminal activities behind legitimate business facades. James Miller's voice came through there, secure line adding context from his classified location. The technology companies involved are desperate for these mineral resources. Without secure supply chains for rare earth elements, their manufacturing capabilities are severely limited. Peggy studied the geological surveys spread across her kitchen table. All this fuss over rocks under our fields, she mused. Though, I suppose it's not really about the rocks. It's about power and control. Exactly, Anne confirmed. These deposits represent strategic resources. Controlling them means controlling crucial supply chains for advanced technology manufacturing. That's why they were willing to invest so heavily in acquiring these properties. Samuel returned from meeting with another group of farmers. Word spreading through the valley. More families are coming forward, sharing their experiences with these people. The wall of silence is breaking down. Sarah's screens showed increased activity throughout the region. They're trying to salvage what they can, she reported, tracking multiple vehicle movements. But with their command structure compromised and law enforcement closing in, they're running out of options. The investigation had expanded far beyond their initial expectations. What began as protecting one farm had exposed an international conspiracy involving corporate espionage, military-grade operations, and the systematic exploitation of rural communities. Look at these requisition orders, Marcus said, examining newly seized documents. High-end surveillance equipment, specialized tools for staged accidents, even materials for creating environmental hazards, all purchased through legitimate-seeming business entities and coordinated with prosecutors as more evidence emerged. We're seeing connections to similar operations in other states. Same methods, same corporate backing, same targeting of vulnerable property owners. This wasn't isolated. It was a systematic campaign. Throughout the afternoon, tactical teams continued securing locations across the valley. Each raid produced more evidence of the criminal enterprise's sophisticated operations and their connections to international technology firms. They really thought they were untouchable, Sarah observed, monitoring police communications. Their security protocols, their counter-surveillance measures, they never expected to face opponents with equal or superior capabilities. Peggy watched from her porch as another group of farmers arrived, each bringing documentation of threats and suspicious incidents. They thought they could pick us off one by one, she said. Instead, they brought us together. The Sugar House Command Center continued processing new intelligence as it arrived. Sarah's analysis revealed patterns linking local intimidation tactics to larger corporate strategies for securing valuable resources. The technology companies knew exactly what they were authorizing, she explained, displaying decoded communications. These weren't rogue operators. This was a carefully planned and approved campaign to acquire strategic resources through any means necessary. Marcus coordinated with tactical teams as they moved against another identified location. Storage facility near the state line, he reported. Looks like they were using it to stage equipment for their accident operations. Teams moving in. Now, Anne received updates from the federal task force. Search warrants being executed at corporate offices in 3 countries. This investigation has gone international. The scale of the operation had grown beyond anything they'd initially anticipated. Miller Farm had become the focal point of a major federal investigation, exposing criminal activities that reached far beyond their rural valley. Mrs. Miller, a senior FBI agent, approached. Your stand against these people has implications beyond just stopping local criminal activity. This case could change how we approach corporate resource acquisition and rural property rights. Sarah's surveillance systems detected new movement in the valley. Another convoy trying to slip through back roads, she reported, but with roadblocks in place and air support overhead, they've got nowhere to go. Throughout the day, evidence teams continued processing materials recovered from multiple raids. Each new discovery reinforced the connection between local intimidation tactics and international corporate interests. The technical sophistication of their operation is remarkable, Marcus noted, examining seized equipment. Military-grade surveillance gear, professional sabotage tools, encrypted communications networks. They spared no expense. Samuel Henderson helped coordinate as more farmers arrived to provide statements. Each story is the same, he reported to investigators. Mysterious accidents, equipment failures, pressure to sell when they're most vulnerable, all following the same playbook. The autumn sun began its descent over the valley as the investigation continued expanding. What had begun as one elderly woman's refusal to be intimidated had evolved into something much larger, the exposure of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. The real story here, Anne observed, reviewing case files, is how they underestimated this community. They saw isolated elderly farmers as easy targets. Instead, they found strength they never expected. Peggy Miller stood at her kitchen window, watching teams process evidence in her yard. Sometimes, she said quietly, the best way to fight darkness is to simply turn on the lights. They counted on their victims staying quiet, staying afraid. They never expected us to stand together. Outside, the peaceful valley showed little sign of the major operation unfolding beneath its surface. But behind that tranquil facade, a sophisticated criminal enterprise was being systematically dismantled, its methods exposed, its power broken by the very community it had tried to intimidate. Evening settled over Miller Farm as the initial phase of raids and evidence collection drew to a close. Inside the farmhouse, federal agents conducted preliminary interviews with witnesses, while Sarah Chen continued monitoring regional activity from her command post in the sugar house. Final tally from today's operations, Sarah announced, reviewing data from multiple agencies. 17 locations raided, 34 suspects in custody, and enough evidence seized to fill 3 evidence storage facilities. Their entire regional infrastructure has been compromised. Marcus Rodriguez entered from his latest security sweep, his expression grim but satisfied. Just got word from state police. They intercepted another convoy trying to evacuate equipment through mountain roads. 4 more arrests, including one of Stavros's key lieutenants. Anne Henderson Walsh coordinated with prosecutors via secure video conference. The evidence is overwhelming, she reported after the call. Financial records, operational documents, surveillance logs, they documented everything. Their own thoroughness will be their undoing. Peggy Miller sat in her familiar rocking chair, watching the activity with keen interest. In my experience, she observed, people who think they're untouchable often create their own best evidence. They never expect to be caught, so they don't bother hiding their tracks. Samuel Henderson returned from meeting with another group of affected farmers. The Wilsons just arrived with their documentation, 3 generations on their land, then suddenly mysterious equipment failures, livestock getting sick. Same pattern we all experienced. Sarah's systems registered new alerts, breaking through another layer of encrypted data. These files show direct communication between corporate leadership and field operators. They knew exactly what methods were being employed. Including the use of force? Anne asked, moving to examine Sarah's screens. Explicitly authorized? Sarah confirmed. They have detailed protocols for escalating pressure tactics, including guidelines for what they call acceptable collateral damage to property and livestock. Marcus studied the tactical implications. They treated this like a military operation. Clear command structure, defined objectives, contingency plans. But they never planned for organized resistance. The investigation had revealed a pattern of systematic exploitation targeting rural communities across multiple states. Corporate interests had employed former military operators to secure valuable resources through intimidation and force, counting on their victims' isolation to prevent exposure. "Look at these geological surveys," Samuel said, examining maps spread across Peggy's kitchen table. "Every property they targeted sits on significant mineral deposits. They knew exactly what they were after. And they knew the market value," Anne added. "These rare earth elements are crucial for technology manufacturing. By forcing sales at depressed prices, they were stealing millions in resources from each property." Sarah's analysis continued, uncovering new connections. "The corporate structure is deliberately complex," she explained, displaying organizational charts. Multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, layers of separation between operators and employers. Classic intelligence tradecraft. Throughout the evening, more farmers arrived to provide statements and evidence. Each account reinforced the pattern of systematic intimidation and exploitation that had plagued their community. "The Robertsons lost their entire dairy herd," Samuel reported, helping organize witness statements. "Mysterious illness, no clear cause. But now we have evidence showing they deliberately contaminated feed supplies." Peggy poured fresh coffee for the investigators, her movement steady despite the long day. "They thought age made us vulnerable," she remarked. "They never considered that experience brings its own kind of strength." James Miller's voice came through their secure line, adding military perspective. "The technology companies behind this, they're desperate for these resources. Without secure supply chains for rare earth elements, their manufacturing capabilities are severely limited, which explains the level of force they were willing to use," Marcus noted. "This wasn't just about property acquisition. It was about controlling strategic resources crucial for advanced technology production," and received updates from federal prosecutors. Search warrants being executed at corporate offices in 3 countries. The investigation has gone international. They're targeting the entire command and control structure. The Sugar House Command Center continued monitoring activity throughout the region. Sarah's surveillance systems tracked multiple attempts by remaining criminal elements to evacuate personnel and equipment. "They're running scared," Marcus observed, watching thermal imaging displays. "Their operational security is breaking down. They're making mistakes." Samuel helped coordinate as more farmers arrived with documentation. "Each story adds another piece to the puzzle," he reported. "Equipment failures, livestock losses, mysterious accidents, all carefully orchestrated to force quick sales." Peggy watched from her porch as evidence teams processed materials in her yard. "It's like my Thomas used to say, the best way to fight darkness is to shine a light on it." These people counted on their victims staying quiet, staying afraid. The investigation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What began as one elderly woman's stand against intimidation had exposed a criminal enterprise operating across multiple states. Mrs. Miller, a federal agent, approached respectfully. "Your refusal to be intimidated didn't just save your farm. It exposed a criminal operation that's been terrorizing rural communities for years." Sarah's systems detected new movement in the valley. "Another convoy trying to slip through back roads," she reported. "But with roadblocks in place and air support overhead, they're just adding to our evidence collection." Throughout the night, tactical teams continued securing locations, identified through their investigation. Each raid produced more evidence of the criminal enterprise's sophisticated operations and their connections to international technology firms. "The technical sophistication is remarkable," Marcus noted, examining seized equipment. Military grade, surveillance gear, professional sabotage tools, encrypted communications networks. They spared no expense and coordinated with prosecutors as more evidence emerged. "We're seeing connections to similar operations in other states. Same methods, same corporate backing, same targeting of vulnerable property owners. This was a systematic campaign. Samuel helped organize as more farmers arrived to provide statements. Word spreading through the valley," he reported. "People are coming forward, sharing their experiences. The wall of silence is breaking down." The autumn night grew cold as the investigation continued expanding. What had begun as protecting one farm had evolved into something much larger. The exposure of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. "They really thought they were untouchable," Sarah observed, monitoring police communications, their security protocols, their counter-surveillance measures. They never expected to face opponents with equal or superior capabilities. Outside, the peaceful valley showed little sign of the major operation unfolding beneath its surface, but behind that tranquil facade, a sophisticated criminal enterprise was being systematically dismantled, its methods exposed, its power broken by the very community it had tried to intimidate. Peggy Miller stood at her kitchen window, watching teams process evidence in her yard. The farm that had been in her family for 5 generations had become the focal point of a major federal investigation, exposing criminal activities that reached far beyond their rural valley. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "standing your ground does more than protect your own interests. It shows others they can stand up too." The night deepened as evidence teams continued their work. Documentation growing of a criminal enterprise that had underestimated the strength and resilience of the rural community it had targeted. What they had seen as vulnerability had proven to be their undoing. The exposure of the criminal enterprise targeting Miller Farm and other rural properties led to significant changes in how corporations approach resource acquisition. Federal legislation was passed strengthening protections for rural landowners, while new oversight measures were implemented to prevent similar intimidation tactics. Peggy Miller still lives on her farm, now a symbol of resistance against corporate exploitation. The sight of motorcycles no longer brings tension to the valley. Instead, the rumble of engines often signals the arrival of veteran riders who stop to pay their respects to the 98-year-old grandmother who stood her ground. Sarah Chen's analysis of the seized data led to investigations in 12 states, exposing similar operations targeting vulnerable communities. Marcus Rodriguez now heads a special task force dedicated to protecting rural properties from corporate intimidation schemes. The rare earth deposits remain safely under Miller Farm, which continues producing maple syrup and organic vegetables. Peggy often says the real treasure isn't in the minerals below, but in the community bonds forged during their stand against intimidation. Samuel Henderson and other affected farmers formed a Rural Property Owners Association, ensuring no one in their community ever faces such threats alone again. Their story has inspired similar organizations across the country. As for the corporate conspirators and their operators, federal prosecutors secured multiple convictions. Michael Stavros and his team faced lengthy sentences for their roles in the criminal enterprise. Today, Miller Farm stands as a testament to the power of community resistance against corporate greed. Peggy Miller's one phone call didn't just save her farm, it sparked a movement that continues protecting rural communities nationwide. If this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We've got more incredible tales of courage, resilience, and justice coming your way. Tomorrow's story will take you on another unforgettable journey you won't want to miss.